Please welcome our good friend David Ayers.
Thank you. Okay, let me open us up in prayer, please. Lord Jesus, I pray for your blessing on this class. I pray that you would help all of us, including those here, just to sort through all this, to accept what is right and to act on it, to reject what is wrong from imperfection that I represent here. And we live in a difficult and challenging cultural moment. And there's nothing to lead us to believe that it's going to get easier, at least not in the short run. So we ask that we would always be loving, that we would always show grace to those with whom we disagree, that we would never be badgered into saying things that are unkind or untrue, but to just calmly and consistently try to speak the truth in love. And we pray for these things in Jesus' name. Amen. And I will appreciate your prayers in the coming months. I've talked to my friend Paul Kenger. He's graciously told me kind of what he thinks I'm in for. And in that sense, I just accept that as part of the world that we live in, which has become much more poisonous, much more toxic. And being kind and trying our best to be factual and accurate in what we say is no longer good enough. It's no longer good enough. And so in that sense, I do appreciate your prayers, and for the college, because anymore people don't just attack you, they attack the people around you. And that's actually my larger concern. Your family, your colleagues, the institution that you love, and I love Grove City College. I thank God every day for Grove City College. So, with that sense, not just because Bill's here. He knows that's how I feel, and he feels the same way, I would say. Okay, so here's my book. You have copies. If you interact with me about the class, certainly you can write me at my college address, which is ayersdj@gcc.edu. But what I've done is I've created an email account separate for my work as an author on this book. And that enables me to focus on this separately and not having those things come in when I'm attempting to do, my other work and to be distracted. Especially knowing that good and bad, you get challenging questions and thoughts and you want to have a chance to think about it, and it's hard to think about it when it's 2 in the afternoon and you got a meeting coming up. So I wanted to kind of separate that. I've also created an author's page on Facebook for the same reason, to kind of separate all this out and to have a separate space to deal with these things that doesn't interfere with the personal stuff that I like to do with my family and my old friends on Facebook. So, okay, I'm almost told that I have a soft voice and I'm struggling a little bit with something that's trying to turn into a cold, so if I'm not speaking up, please let me know. Okay, what I want to deal with today is the question of definition. Years ago, 30 years ago, when I taught my first marriage and family class at the King's College, which at that time was in Briarcliff Manor, New York, the students asked why I spent so much time on the definition of marriage and the definition of family. They thought that was the usual tedium from a sociologist. And I had spent a few years at that point working on what was then the kind of, I guess you would call it the early religious right in Washington, D.C., and watched what was transpiring under Jimmy Carter and then under Ronald Reagan. Watched endless debates over the fact that Carter had the temerity to use the term family in the singular for a conference at the White House, for which he was attacked. That was in the 1970s, because he was assuming there was something called the family. And I told students at that time, I said, look, this is going to become the most important debate in our generation. If you don't get this right, you can't get anything right. Everything else you're going to get wrong. Because this has to do with the question of design, starting where God starts. And design means, what is marriage and what is it supposed to do? What is its basic nature? What is its basic structure? And what is its purpose or function? And unless you do that, anything you say is going to be basically in the air. But one of my graduate advisors at New York University used to say, if you don't define your terms, you literally don't know what you're talking about, which is true. Well, we're talking about marriage today. What is marriage? I don't know. Well, then you don't know what you're talking about. I mean, you literally don't know what you're talking about, and nothing else makes sense. Imagine a biologist trying to discuss wolves. And the biologist wants to tell you whether the wolf population is increasing or not, whether it's healthy or not, whether it's dangerous or not, what its habits are, and what public policy should be related to wolves. But the problem is they cannot distinguish a wolf from a coyote or a dog. They literally don't know what they're talking about. Nothing after that point is going to make any sense because you have to take things that are kind of similar but not exactly the same thing and distinguish them. If you can't distinguish living together, for example, from marriage, then you literally don't know what you're talking about. We shy away from that question, however, because to define something is to set boundaries around it. And that means something that wants to be it is not. Which means, by the way, it's not inclusive. And now you're in trouble. Because you literally have to be able to say this is and this is not. Imagine that you were going to engage an architectural firm to build a warehouse. You'd have to know what a warehouse was and distinguish it from a manufacturing facility or a garage, would you not? Even though they're similar, they're not exactly the same thing. And the architect would want to know, what do you intend this warehouse to do? If you don't know what it is and what it's supposed to do, how can I build it for you? How can I fix it? I need to know those things. How can we help people have a good marriage or find a good spouse or understand the effects of marital breakdowns on individuals, the churches, and society if we don't know what marriage is and what it's for? Good spouse for what? And for us, and by the way, not just as Christians, but for all the human race, because this is a creational ordinance. What really matters is God's definition and God's purposes. What is God's design? What is the holy creational design? Christians have historically said this is a divine institution, a divine ordinance. A. Hodge, in his commentary on the Westminster Confession of Faith, said this: the law of marriage and the condition of its contract, continuance, and dissolution are laid down by the Word of God. Because it is creational, he said, we as citizens have an obligation as citizens. And by the way, he was not a theonomist. I'm not a theonomist, if you know what theonomy is. I don't believe in reimposing the Old Testament law on modern society. I don't think every moral law should be a civil law. However, marriage is a creational ordinance. It's built into nature. It's true for all human flesh. And so if we care about our neighbors, we will advance an essentially Christian understanding of marriage's structure and design and want the state to uphold and defend that. And that's what A. Hodge said, the Princeton theologian. As Christians, we have an obligation as citizens to promote God's design for marriage in the larger society because it is a creational ordinance, and to act against it is to act contrary to nature. By the way, my Catholic friends tell me all the time that the Protestants are not tuned enough to natural law, and I tend to agree with them, although that's changing. We need to be able to appeal to natural law and to natural design in discussing these things, and our Catholic brothers and sisters can help us with that to some extent, because they've done a little bit more of that. Nevertheless, this is built into nature. And anthropology shows that the overwhelming majority of human cultures comply substantially or completely with the basic framework of these creational ordinances. At least until the West over the last couple of decades. No matter what people tell you, by the way, what we've created in the West in the last 20 years does not have any cultural precedent that we're aware of, no matter what they tell you. And I teach cultural anthropology. It does not. We must also note that marriage, as designed by God, was built into his larger design for the human race before the fall. It is an essential part of God's design. Now, in his foreknowledge and goodness, he understood he knew the fall was coming, and marriage became a bulwark against the fall, against sin and loneliness and disease and suffering and pain. Nevertheless, in a world with no disease, suffering, and pain, you would have still had marriage. Read Paralander, read the second book of C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy, and he describes from his imagination what the world would have looked like had Adam and Eve never fallen. They would have been vice regents of creation, and they would have produced children and built societies rooted in marriage and family. The classic Anglican wedding ceremony says that marriage was invented, quote, in man's innocency. Marriage is not something we invent. We enter into it. We accept its structures. It's a house, and we enter it, and we accept its restraints and its demands, whether we like them or not. We begin at the beginning where God does in Genesis 1 and 2, and we note that this passage is alluded to often throughout the entire Bible, and including in Ephesians 5 and by Jesus over and over again in his teaching about marriage. Now, I'm not going to read this. I've tried to highlight some of the essentials. Let me see if I got my pointer here. It's not working. Okay. Male and female, procreative, mutual help, one flesh, father, mother, husband, wife. Ooh. The politically incorrect Bible. By the way, Jesus repeated this virtually word for word, and Paul repeated this virtually word for word. From the beginning, said Jesus. This was not so, this easy divorce you're talking about. This woman burns her supper and her husband says goodbye. The woman gets Alzheimer's disease and the husband hospitalizes and abandons her. No, 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 no. From creation, these things were not so. They are joined together as one flesh. The woman is bone of bone, flesh of the man. They are distinct and yet one. It is a binary. Historically, Christianity has always paid attention to design and dealing with marriage and reminding Christians about this often. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Westminster Confession of Faith. Notice how closely it mimics Genesis. We're right back to a man, a woman, mutual help, procreation, sex, and adding some other things, consent. By the way, marriage did not need to be added to prevent uncleanness in the garden. It was a sexual relationship, but the sexual relationship had not been sullied at that point. It was pure. It was an innocent one. There was no lust in it, no selfishness in it, but it was there. By the way, one of my beefs with the church fathers, much as I like them, is that many of them actually tried to claim that Adam and Eve had no sex in the garden. And one church father actually argued that they procreated like vegetables so that they wouldn't have to sin by having, well, that's not how it worked. What are you thinking, Matt? The Book of Common Prayer, which I really like. The mystical union between Christ and the church, the procreation of children, sexual relationship, a remedy against sin, fornication. The only people who should refrain from marriage are those who can refrain, who have what is known as continence, who basically can refrain from the sexual relationship. Mutual society, help, comfort, prosperity, adversity, joining together. The one flesh. The OPC Book of Church Order. God instituted marriage at the beginning. Union not to be severed. Divine ordinance, one flesh, mystical union between Christ and the church. Mutual help, propagation. the avoidance of sexual immorality. There's not a lot of variation here. By the way, later on when we talk about the functions of marriage, next week I'll talk a little bit about this different take the Roman Catholic Church has on this, which is compatible but places emphasis in different places. So at least you can understand that. Okay. So having said this, then how do we define marriage? And I'm sorry, this would be a little bit like drinking from a fire hose, and I want to, first of all, this represents a long history of development. The church worked its way towards these things that we now accept almost universally. Remember, the church was engaging pagan cultures that had practices that took hundreds of years to displace. And they had to go up against those kinds of practices and work them through and think about them and look at the scriptures and church doctrine and church history and then apply them and then try to move things in that direction. It didn't just happen right away. It wasn't like the truth evolved, but what evolved is our understanding of the truth as it applies to varying social practices. Okay. Arranged marriages, secret marriages, literal concubinage, polygamy, and all these other things were out there as the church extended itself into the larger world, and they had to engage those things. And they had to bring people into the church who were already practicing those things and didn't really understand why they were wrong. The other thing is that it's always been a balancing act in how much the civil codes, the magistrate or the state, should reflect strict Christian teaching. The Catholic Church struggled with that. Martin Luther struggled with that a lot. He was being approached by German princes and said, "We know what the Bible teaches about this, but how much room can we give people to not go along with this? Because most Germans are only technically Christian. They're not really practitioners of this, and if we try to institute it, are we just going to produce chaos? Is there a way we can meet them halfway? Do the divorce laws have to be based on the strict laws of the Bible, as the Catholics insist, or can we allow non-Christians to divorce in ways that the church should not allow, for reasons that the church would not allow?" And Martin Luther and most of his contemporaries, their answer was yes. There's a middle point. It doesn't have to be a one-to-one relationship. You don't lose sight of what the Bible teaches, nor should the church abandon it. But the civil code has to represent some kind of a practical compromise, recognizing that we're salt in the world, and the world has not yet been converted completely. We have to somehow engage it where we find it. It's amazing some of the things those guys came up with, how contemporary a lot of those debates look to us when we look at this historically. One of the great achievements in marriage, which really skyrocketed with the Reformation and then really became accepted strongly and adopted, by the Catholics as well, is that marriage should be truly volitional, because we want people to be able to love each other for a lifetime and to at some level choose their partner, but choose them for the right reasons with guidance within structures and parameters. And anything that's truly volitional has to be based on what we would now call, although this term wasn't typically used by them, informed consent. Nobody should be forced into marriage, and nobody should be defrauded into marriage, and no marriage can be valid that's involved trickery or deception. This wasn't generally accepted 600 or 700 years ago, believe me. And yet the church found its way towards that. What's oftentimes helpful here, and we don't think about this much, is the differentiation of annulment and divorce. If you're saying that something is a grounds for an annulment, then what you're saying is that it's grounds for saying that this violated the definition of marriage. A true marriage never took place. The husband was not informed about something critical about the wife, and if he had known it, he would never have married her. There was a secret marriage in a town 30 miles away that was being hidden. These kids were separated as children, and it turns out that they share the same biological father. or they share the same biological mother. It's incest. It can't be a marriage. By the way, that's why they publish marriage bans, not just in the church where the people were getting married, but in the whole region, because when they said, is there any reason that these two should not be wed, it was a serious question. What they meant is this a valid marriage, or is there something that we don't know about here that we need to take care of? Did this person have a marriage somewhere else? The speak now or forever hold your peace was a serious question. Wedding bans were a serious notice, kind of like you see in the newspaper notices about lawsuits and stuff. Legally, we have to make sure that the public knows this is happening and that there's not a problem here, that there's not a prior contract that invalidates this. I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but in the book Moll Flanders, Daniel Defoe depicts a woman who falls in love with a sea captain on her way to America, marries him, and they have a family and everything's great until she finds out that his mother and her mother are the same person, and that she had married her half-brother. That's in Moll Flanders. If you think that these old-timers didn't think about this stuff, that book's several hundred years old. Moll Flanders is tortured by this fact. Her husband never finds out that he married his own sister, but she can no longer comfortably be married to him, and she separates from him. Now, what we would say is that the marriage would be annulled. It would be a declaration that this marriage was invalid. By the way, it doesn't necessarily involve fault. In this situation, there was no fault at all. You just can't marry your sister. Okay. These parameters culturally are universal or near universal in nature. So this is important stuff. Okay, so what are some of these parameters? Okay. Specifically. First of all, marriage is a one-flesh relationship. There is no other relationship among humankind like it. As one Puritan said, God, by taking Eve out of Adam's side, made of one person two. And then by reuniting them in marriage, he made of two persons one. How many of you had Paul Stuckey's wedding song sung at your wedding? What it means is that I'm dating you really badly. Although my third daughter had me sing it at her wedding 3 years ago, almost to today. As it was in the beginning, is now until the end. Woman draws her life from man and gives it back again. That's literally true. There is no other human relationship like that. None. And I tell people they should do this. And if I did it, my wife would get embarrassed and tell me to get out of the room. But for the couple to look each other in the eye and say, you are bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. By the way, think of what flows from that. If you're bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, do I abandon you because you got senile dementia and you can no longer meet my needs? On what planet? And as we're going to see later, that one flesh relationship connects back to the relationship that God himself has with his people, that Jesus has with the church. The Bible ends with the wedding supper of the Lamb. What condition would it be required for Jesus Christ to abandon me once he has set his love on me and covenanted with me and his blood has covered my sin? The answer is none. None. Nothing past, present, and future can separate me from the love of Christ. Shouldn't that be true for you and your spouse? You are one flesh. That's what Jesus said. Now, by the way, don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean that divorce is never valid and that remarriage is never valid. It's always a tragedy, however, because it is the rending of one flesh. We should never, ever kid ourselves about that. Marriage is a sexual relationship, which in itself is a picture and the realization of the one flesh relationship. We have always understood that this refers to as sexual intercourse, by the way, and annulment laws oftentimes take this into account. By the way, I'll give you two authorities. Bill Clinton. Were you committing perjury? No. But you said you never had sex with that woman. I know, but we never had intercourse. Now, we're not going to go there too deeply. As a lawyer, Bill Clinton argued it made sense, actually, because the marital act is intercourse. We refer to that as consummation. And consummation is normally, failure to consummate is normally grounds for an annulment. Now, in my book, I get into something, and I actually looked at all the contemporary news accounts, and I looked at the actual legislation. Huge debate in Great Britain, which, remember, has this common law that goes back centuries, and marriage law is based on common law. So they're very thoughtful about this stuff. Well, common law allows for annulment in the case of non-consummation. So they wanted to have same-sex marriage. They debated endlessly whether or not a man and a man and a woman could consummate their marriage legally, and they determined that they couldn't because there was no physical act possible to them that came close. So they created a rider, legal rider, that exempted same-sex marriage for annulment on the basis of non-consummation. Now, the gay rights lobby wanted them to eliminate annulment on the basis of non-consummation so that their marriages would be exactly the same. But then there was an uproar saying, you're going to tell a heterosexual couple that they cannot annul based on non-consummation? A privilege that's existed for over 1,000 years in the common law and is almost universally recognized just to get this bill passed? No, we're not going to do it. So Parliament said, we're not going to eliminate that, but we can't. But what that would mean is that any gay couple would immediately be able to have their marriage annulled. By the way, I'm waiting for that to get tested in the United States, because unlike the Supreme Court, Parliament actually thought about that and was aware of the history of it. But it actually means that there are two marriages in Great Britain now. They're literally distinct. One requires intercourse, the other does not. Now think about that. So it's a pretty serious thing. By the way, if Bill Clinton agrees with me, anybody will agree with me. Okay. When I tell students that, they're like, I've never heard that before. Has anybody argued that? So I have, but nobody cares what I think. Okay. It's a public as well as a private relationship. One of the big things that the early church struggled with, and not just early church, but through the Middle Ages, was secret marriages, clandestine or secret marriages. The Eastern Empire, the Byzantines, completely illegalized them. They said no witnesses, no marriage. No public vow before witnesses, no marriage. By the way, that's why we have notary publics, right? Because we want certain things to be witnessed in order for them to be legally valid. The Western Church allowed it, but seriously frowned on it until it kind of reached a head around the 1200s and 1100s. According to James Brundage, Law, Sex, and Christian Society in Medieval Europe, a real cliffhanging book. From about the 12th century forward, this became an urgent matter that they really had to tackle, and they ultimately decided no witnesses, no marriage. By the way, remember the old movies when somebody shows up at the Justice of the Peace in a rainstorm at 2 in the morning and they want to get married? And the Justice of the Peace would have to find two people to come downstairs and stand there and watch. My wife and I were actually witnesses at a Justice of the Peace wedding about 5 years ago. That requirement stands. The church worked towards it, but it makes sense because covenants must be witnessed. Covenants must be witnessed. Okay. What about common law marriages? Oh, sorry. Wait a second. Yeah, what about common law marriage? Oops. Okay. Common law marriage becomes a real marriage not because the people are simply living together for a long time, although that's a requirement. But it becomes a contract because they publicly present themselves as a husband and a wife. That's typically the law of common law marriage. In other words, they have made a public declaration. And by the way, on the frontier, that was oftentimes all people had, right? You moved in with a woman and you declared yourself to be married and you told the community that you were married, but there was no judge, there was no court, there was no priest, you know what I'm saying? So that's kind of what they did. When it was a real marriage, but people say, well, then you didn't need witnesses. Yes, they did, because they declared themselves before the community to be married, and they accepted the obligations of it, and then they presented themselves to people as husband and wife. By the way, if you've read the book Alexander Hamilton, that's what Hamilton's parents did. The reason it wasn't valid was because his mother's first husband refused to divorce her. And so legally, the English government viewed it as bigamy. And it stained his whole life. It was a stain on his whole life. But they presented themselves as married. And under normal conditions, they would have been a common law married couple. Alexander Hamilton is a really interesting guy. And, by the way, was a real Christian, as far as I could tell. Okay, based at least on the book. All right. It's a relationship. It's a covenantal relationship. The old Puritans and Reformers and Hodge and so forth had no problem using the word contract. I shy away from the word, and I remember having discussions actually with now senior pastor Nate Devlin about this. The problem with the word contract is that in the modern vernacular it's very narrow and sterile. So when somebody in the 19th century used the word contract, and particularly used it in accompanied marriage, they understood it to be something very robust. But now we think of contract as a very narrow, fine print kind of thing with riders and addendums and tons of exit routes. And in fact, marriage has always been understood to be a covenant, which means that God himself is the third party to all marriages, secular or not, Christian or not, and seals them by covenant. It is his holy ordinance. It is his holy covenant. Okay. And as a covenant or a contract, it always carries both implicit and explicit requirements for both spouses and their obligations towards any future offspring. Okay. It has to be a conjugal, not consanguinal relationship. In other words, it cannot involve what is legally viewed as incestual relationship. Now, there's been some debates about that. How many of you seen enough of Jane Austen to know that it get pretty weird? From infancy, they were intended for each other. Their mother and I planned it from the crib. You remember that from Pride and Prejudice? The problem is, Mom was the woman's sister, and they were first cousins. I've looked this up, by the way. First cousin marriages are legal in roughly half of American states, illegal in the other states. Where they are legal, they're oftentimes only legal if the couple is infertile or agrees to become so, based on what we now know. But in Jane Austen's England, it was oftentimes preferred because it kept property within close family lines. In fact, half-brothers and sisters would sometimes get married. We now recognize that that is ancestral. So does the scriptures, by the way. By the way, brother, sister, parent, child is universal, except in really odd situations. How many of you, I tend to get off on tangents, I'm sorry. But how many of you know that Cleopatra was married to her brother and then had him drowned? She did not like him. But that was fairly common. On the other hand, nobody holds up Egyptian aristocracy as a paragon of Christian virtue either. And by the way, that inbreeding in the British royal and the European royal families led to all kinds of serious health problems, which is one reason we kind of steer clear. But I actually have, I actually have a student who married his first cousin, graduated many years ago. I said, "How are you going to do that?" He said, "Well, they identified a state where they could go, and it was legal, and so that's where they went." I was like, "Okay." He wasn't asking my advice, so it's still done. Relationship between one man and one woman. Marriage is monogamous. Marriage is heterosexual. By the way, when you see in the confessions and in Anglicanism and so forth these official doctrinal statements that marriage is between one man and one woman, what they were normally thinking about was polygamy, right? Having more than one wife at the same time, because it would have never occurred to them that they needed to worry about the man-woman part. On the other hand, the Puritans could be both exhausting and exhaustive. Right? Puritan is a guy who can preach for 1 year on a single verse, and each sermon could be 2 hours long. So I thought, I wonder if they dealt with this. Well, sure enough, William Gow, in his book Domestical Duties, said this: the male must choose a female, and the female must choose a male. He went on to note that marrying someone of the same sex violated every purpose and design that God has for marriage, that it violates prohibitions on homosexuality. And then he basically went on and summarized everything that anybody has said within the last 10 years as a case against same-sex marriage. And this was like 350 years ago. And then he went on because, I mean, nobody thought about it. I mean, you'd get hung for bringing that up as a. I mean, even King James would have had you dangling from the yardarms for even suggesting that. But nevertheless, that's nobody thought that would become an issue. The intention at the time the union is formed is towards lifelong marriage. We obviously can have different divorce rules, but nevertheless, a temporary contract, a time-limited contract, is not a marriage. The intention at marriage should be that this is a lifelong union. You're marrying someone that you intend to stay with for the rest of your life. However, marriage does end at death. We're not married in heaven, no matter what people put on their gravestones. And it feels good sentimentally, I understand it. We recognize each other in heaven. In heaven, I will recognize my wife. In heaven, I will recognize my sons and daughters, my grandchildren. I will love them, and we will remember the life we had here. But we will be like angels in heaven. Those relationships will be done at that level. And we will be married in heaven to Christ. Therefore, remarriage following widowhood is no sin. By the way, the Puritans would take this to extreme. And it was usually the guy that died first. A lot of times, the woman would seal a contract of betrothal at her husband's wake. My wife's sitting in the back. Please don't do that. You know, wait a month or two, and make sure that he's really rich.
At least wait until after the wake.
Yeah, I mean decency, man. The Eastern Orthodox Church doesn't believe it, and I've tried to follow their doctrine on this. They go into so many. I'm sorry, I don't want to scandalize my Orthodox friends, but what they come up with to try to explain away Matthew 22:30 is just amazing. Because they say, well, in 1 Corinthians it says love never dies. A husband and wife love each other, therefore it never dies. So they believe in something called eternal marriage. Now they will grudgingly allow a widow to marry after her husband's death or vice versa. But it's a concession, and the Mass officiating it is a penitential Mass. Like, oh, we're sorry, God, we're sorry we're letting this happen. Honey, you don't have to do that. And the priests aren't allowed to remarry at all. So, by the way, Orthodox priests can get married. So, you're 30 years old, you just got married, you've taken holy orders in the Greek Orthodox Church, and your wife keels over. You're out of luck, dude. You've got a problem, because you either leave the priesthood or you're not going to get married. Okay. All right. Marriage is a voluntary relationship. It cannot involve force, cannot involve fraud, and it ought to involve informed consent. In other words, anything that would have prevented your spouse from marrying you should be out on the table. And by the way, part of premarital counseling, which is sometimes one of the more difficult parts, but all good premarital counseling walks people through the process of tastefully and thoughtfully settling those issues with each other. The skeletons can't be in the closet at that point. And by the way, would you really want them to be? Skeletons have a habit of dancing out of the closet. And the other thing is it actually literally makes the relationship annullable, because in fact you've withheld vital information from your spouse. Usually that's not a big issue. Sometimes there's some pretty dicey stuff back there. And you have to find a way to do that. It's hard, but it's necessary. And oftentimes it helps to have a counselor walk them through that process. Marriage is both civil and religious. It is both a state ordinance and it's a civil ordinance. By the way, a couple that gets a Vegas wedding with an Elvis impersonator is still married, and we in the church are bound to respect and enforce that marriage. However, I firmly believe, as does your pastor, it's normally best for Christian couples to marry in their church before the people that they've worshiped God with. And if they don't want to, I kind of want to know why. That's important. EPC Book of Church Order, which is your church, specifically says that couples should be discouraged from marrying outside the church. However, should they do so? By the way, he's a great guy, but we had a professor take a group of students to a conference in Las Vegas and get married while he was there. That was last month. Oh, you're married. Isn't that great? Are they married? Yes. Okay. Sorry, I know this is long. Marriage symbolizes the relationship of Christ and his church. This is a profound mystery, says Paul. It is tied to the covenantal and one-flesh reality of marriage. God presents himself as a husband and a groom repeatedly in both testaments of the Scripture. The Bible ends that way. And what Doug Wilson says is actually true, and it would be true for the wife in a different way. Every husband represents Jesus Christ. He either represents Jesus Christ accurately or he represents Jesus Christ badly. It's a fixed part of marriage. There's nothing in those statements that says marriage should represent Christ in the church. What's in there says that it does. As Christ loved the church and gave himself for her that he might sanctify her, cleansing her by the washing of water with the blood, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. One of the things that worked its way into my book as a result of conversations with your pastor, Nate, was talking about marriage as a form of friendship and what distinguishes it from other friendship. And Nate turned me on to Aristotle and Aristotle's understanding of friendship, that the highest form of friendship is friendship that is jealous for the moral character of that which you love. A friend who cares about you morally and protects you morally and defends your reputation is the greatest of all possible friends, right? Every marriage should be a friendship like that, in which you want the other person to be spotless and without blemish. And I will say that I don't always make it easy for my wife to help me in that regard. Finally, marriage in turn reflects the eternal Trinity itself, the perfect relationship of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit from before time. It reflects it in its one-fleshedness, and it reflects it in its fruitfulness, in its beginning of life. Out of the Trinity, life emerges. Out of marriage, life emerges. This is Pope Benedict. In marriage, the man and woman created in God's image become one flesh. That is a communion of love that generates new life. The human family, in a certain sense, is an icon of the Trinity because of its interpersonal love and the fruitfulness of this love. So let me finish with this, and we might have a little bit of time for questions. You can also contact me by email, and I don't have preamble stuff to deal with next week, so please, if you're here next week, ask it. I'll make sure that there's time at the beginning and say, do you have any questions from last week? Let's talk about that. Marriage is an irreplaceable, this is my definition of marriage, based on this. Marriage is an irreplaceable and core institution of human society. Created by God before the fall of Adam and Eve, which communicates deep spiritual truth, including speaking to the human race about the relationship of God to his people, pointing to the marriage between Christ and his church at the end of history. In it, one man and one woman, who are not restrained by conditions that would invalidate their union, and who are fully informed in all relevant matters, freely and publicly enter into the marital covenant through solemn vows to accept and fulfill all the obligations of marriage, including an exclusive sexual relationship for all the days in which both live. They consummate these vows through sexual intercourse. Okay. Again, I know a lot like drinking through a fire hose. We have time for any questions, Tom? I know I pushed it really badly.
1 or 2 minutes.
And then, like I said, save them. Come next week. We'll have time at that point. And please feel free to email me and communicate with me anything that you'd rather ask about privately. Okay. Sorry.
Thanks, David.
Sure.
Good stuff.
Yeah, I know a lot.
See you next week.